Hey everybody, this is Mr. Baker. Hope you're doing well. This is actually another installment of Baker's Corner, and we are actually going to do a discussion today on one really important element of the latter 1800s, also known to a lot of people as the Gilded Age time period, as the development of American urbanization. So I want to start us off by a big picture question. We're going to do two lessons. One is going to be on urbanization. The other one is going to be on Gilded Age politics and some of the political developments of the time period. Okay, so just one quick question. When you think of urbanization, what usually comes to mind? Okay, and for a lot of people, they think of big cities. So for those of you that have traveled to different parts of the country or maybe in the world environment, you probably have noticed that cities are big, right? They usually have a lot of transportation pieces to them. They usually have a lot of population. Oftentimes, cities are also going to be very diverse areas from the standpoint of people that are coming from different places and very international in focus at times. Okay. And so we're going to see a lot of that developing over the course of the United States. Not that it's not been happening, but certainly it's going to really, what I call, guys, balloon with population. The thing that's interesting, as we'll talk about more in a second, is that a lot of this population of new immigrants is going to be very different, okay, than what we've actually seen with some of the previous eras of American immigration. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we're talking about the period of time that's called the Gilded Age, all right, it's actually an interesting story with how it got started. So we'll get to that in a second. But I want you guys to take a look at what you see in front of you and ask yourself the question, what really stands out about these images? Well, maybe the one on the left is not as much of a political cartoon, but the ones on the right definitely are. Okay. So guys, a lot of historians like to contend, for good reason, that during this time period, and we'll look at this a little bit more next time, that we're going to have the emergence of what we call the modern political cartoon. Okay, so I want you all to think, just to kind of get your brains, kind of operating, guys, a little bit right now. What do you think that might mean when we say the modern political cartoon? Okay, and for a lot of people, it's like, well, these are cartoons that are going to be, maybe they're more in color, as you can see here, with the one that actually has Johnny Rockefeller in the perspective, is something to keep in mind. Okay, this one down here is not in color, but yet, again, maybe a certain use of pen or something like that. Okay, but the idea, guys, in a sense, is that you're also looking at modern issues that are going to continue into the earlier 1900s, right? So think about, guys, if you have had the lesson on the rise of big business, what is going to be Rockefeller's connection to big business? It's going to be he's making a ton of money, right? He builds up this company called Standard Oil. Obviously, he becomes a very wealthy man as a result. And what kind of perspective does this cartoonist have? Well, it's really not meant to be very positive, right? So, he's holding, obviously the government kind of in his palm or whatever, at least parts of it. And this is really meant, guys, to send the message that you have a lot of these big business people, robber barons, basically, is what this cartoon is getting at, that's actually going to be really gaining a lot of control over things like the government and society and driving the economy. Okay. And there are some pros to that, right? Jobs are created, but as we'll see here in a second, guys, and we've already talked about a little bit, you are going to see some considerable problems when it comes to the working class. Okay. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So a lot of students, guys, like to ask the question, okay, Mr. Baker, where do we get the term the Gilded Age? Okay. And if you're a junior, I know at my school in North Carolina, juniors are going to study usually American history. They're also going to study American literature. Okay. Well, it's actually created by a gentleman that you see on the slide here by the name of Mark Twain, right? So a lot of you have heard of him. If you've heard of Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer, some of his other works. And guys, a lot of us, we think of him as a literary writer, which certainly makes a lot of sense. But he was also somebody that had a lot to say about the political side of the time period. Okay, so he had a lot to say about the idea of urban poverty in some cases. He talked about, economic problems. He also had some pretty strong opinions on imperialism, right, which we're not going to study today. But the idea about America being more active in the world as far as controlling other places and becoming a larger, overseas empire and all those things. But that'll be a topic that we study in a couple of units from now. Okay. And so he coins this term. And the question is, guys, all right, what in the world does gilded mean? Well, we're looking at a time period that's approximately 25 to 30 years almost. Okay. And, there's debate on when does it start, when does it stop, that kind of thing. We're not going to get too worried about that. But the idea of gilded is something, guys, that's kind of covered with a glittering of gold. Okay. So when we think of gold, we think of things that are polished, they're really pretty, they have a lot of appeal to them. Okay. And think about what he's getting at. So there's going to be something of value of gold that is overshadowing some things that aren't as positive. Okay. And so the economic prosperity of people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, JP Morgan, the list goes on and on. Those are going to be some of the things, they're building businesses, they're establishing jobs, right? They're adding, money to philanthropy to be able to build, things like schools and, libraries and, concert halls and things like that. But the question is, what is the wealth overshadowing? Okay. And it's overshadowing things like the big development of what we call the furthering of the division between the rich and the poor, right? The rich are getting richer. And even though, people are making some more money, there's a widening gap. That's the word I was looking for, between the rich and the poor, right? Okay. And so that's something to keep in mind. And so government is going to be going through some kind of like growing pains in this time period with corruption. There's going to be a lot of corruption, as we'll look at next time, with especially the Grant administration. There's local corruption with things like political machines, as we'll look at. Okay. And so you want to really keep that in mind. And so, political corruption usually makes us think that people are not exactly acting in the public good all the time. And as a result of that, the question is, what do we do to remedy it? All right. That'll actually be a study that we do on the progressive era, not next time, but one of the times after that. Okay. And then also the social issues of society. Okay. So guys, think about the first topic that I referenced today, urbanization. Okay. So the question is, you go, guys, to urban places, what kind of social issues do you see that are maybe a little bit different, or maybe even a little bit more developed in some cases, as you would see in rural areas, right? It could be things like urban poverty, maybe, the idea of people that are literally, more homeless in the area. You walk down the street and it's really evident there. Okay. If you've ever been to larger cities, this is not really pleasant to think about, but the idea of people, guys, living in cardboard boxes or at least sleeping on them at times. Okay. Those are realistic social issues. Okay. And one historian put it like this. He said, these are not new issues to the United States, right? In other words, they've existed prior to the latter part of the 19th century, 1800s, and moving forward. Okay. But you got to remember, we're looking at a time period, guys, where we see a lot of change, right? We see a lot of change with technology. There's a larger amount of newspapers that are available to people. The idea of photojournalism, as we'll look at more with our study of progressivism. Okay. A lot of things, guys, that are happening. People are able to take, snapshot photos, not to the extent of now where they have the iPhones to do it and things like that, just like this. But they do have the ability to take pictures and certainly make the public more knowledgeable and also informed. Okay. So with that being said, what is the big picture of the development of the city in the latter 19th century, Okay. And the answer is, guys, these are a lot of the social issues that we're talking about, right? And they could also be considered economic and political as well, because there is a connection. Okay. But the idea of housing, guys, imagine you go to a big city, right? New York City, Chicago, right? Places like that you come across quite a bit. All right. Rome, places like that if you've traveled internationally. Okay. These cities are big, usually population wise. They're going to have millions of people. You go further out, you're going to see, guys, a very large, area as well. The center, the urban core, as it's known as, the center is usually going to be a lot of things where people operate, etc. Okay, and housing becomes a problem. But guys, think about why. All right, we're going to look at that on the next slide for a moment. But the idea, guys, of being able to build up and not out, that's going to create a series of issues, right? So you don't have the space to move elsewhere, all right, outward, okay? We'll come back to the issue of dumbbell tenements, but that's going to be kind of like a form of housing that's very cramped, okay? And that kind of has a little bit to do with our next discussion on immigration, right? Which is a very big part of today's lesson. Sanitation issues, okay? So you're looking, guys, at the idea of, water is not going to be well sanitized in a lot of areas, okay? Same thing if you're talking about people, guys, that are not really disposing of their trash in a sanitary way. So health problems, think about, guys, those kinds of things that happen. And then you're also looking at the idea as cities, guys, expand in size. You're looking at the idea of moving into the direction of transportation changes, right? Now, a lot of you are thinking, well, Mr. Baker, I've been to a big city and I took the subway, or I took the metro, or maybe you took a taxi cab, or God forbid you would try to drive. That's pretty crazy. I've done that a couple of times. Okay. But guys, at the end of the day, what has to happen, you're going to see a lot of these forms of transportation that make these things not necessarily easy, but certainly more accessible. Okay. So the rise of elevators, that's one of your earlier forms of elevators, electric trolleys, okay, that are going to be very essential. Now, occasionally you'll go to a city today, or at least, some of them, and you'll notice that they have these trolleys that still operate, but some of them have them as kind of like more tourist pieces, okay? So anyway, over time that changes, but we're looking at the ideas of subway. And the last but not least, the idea of overcrowding. Okay, so guys, think about it like this. When you're looking at overcrowding, you're talking about having massive population in an area that really does not always have, the comfort of accommodating people of those numbers. And take a look, guys. I mean, you're going to have some people, a good number anyway, moving from rural areas of the United States, right? So they're going to say, whoa, I no longer want to be a farmer in rural, let's say New York or wherever, okay? And they're going to actually move into the city. So they are going to become overcrowded because of migration within the country. But guys, one of the biggest reasons why is going to be the new immigrants, right? And these are actually, we'll look at them more in a second, guys, but these new immigrants are going to be very different in, shall we say, where they're from, right? So a lot of your old immigrants, as they were known as, were from places like Northern Europe, Western Europe. So places like Germany, places like France, places like England, Scotland, Ireland, places like that. Okay, what we notice, guys, with these new immigrants is that they're coming from a lot of different diverse European communities, more or less. Okay, you see a little bit of Chinese immigration happening, right, with the railroad, some places like that, or some countries like that. But for the most part, as we'll look at next time, there is going to be some legislation that really puts some pretty strong restrictions on especially Chinese immigrants and even those moving into the 1920s. Okay, so that's a ways off, but something to keep in the front of our minds. Okay, so who are these new immigrants? The best way I can explain them to you all is that they're mostly immigrants that came from two different regions or parts of Europe. So they're from they're from Southern Europe, and they're also from Eastern Europe. Okay, so a lot of you guys might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, what countries lie within those two regions? Well, it's good that you asked that. Southern Europe, you're going to see a lot of people from Greece. You're going to see a huge influx of people from places like Italy, right? Spain to an extent, but Italy is going to be really big. Okay. And then, from Eastern Europe, you're going to see some people coming from parts of Austria and Hungary, which were, remember, guys, still connected until the end of World War I. That's around 1918, 1919. Okay. You're going to have a lot of Russians. You're going to see a lot of Polish people coming over. So guys, think about what all are they bringing with them that's going to make them more diverse. They're bringing different languages. They're bringing different religions, right? Roman Catholicism, Greek Orthodox, quite a few people of Jewish background are going to be immigrating, etc. Okay. So therefore, what do we notice? We notice a lot of diversity. Okay. And for one of the reasons, guys, that you're going to see is that a lot of these immigrants are going to be settling in these tenement houses. Okay. So those of you that have probably not gone to college yet, if you're watching this and you have, you may be heard of a dormitory that has a suite system where you have like one bathroom for like 5 or 6 different rooms that holds maybe 2 or 3 people, give or take. Well, guys, imagine these kinds of buildings, and more than likely, you're talking about the idea of families. Now, this family, we don't know if this is the entire family or not, but you see the father, I would assume the mother, looks like a daughter. Guys, imagine a place that size that you read about the stories, people like Jacob Rees that actually published things, and actually, I think this was either one of his pictures or one that was similar to what he would take. Okay, but guys, imagine what's the one thing that pops up with a lot of these immigrants, and that is they are coming to the United States for the American dream, but not all of them stayed. Okay. There's an expression that we use for those that stayed over short term and then went back to their home of origin, and that is what we call birds of passage. Okay, so think about it like this. Birds like to fly south for the winter. We've always heard that, right? These birds of passage do not stay in the United States long term. They eventually go back. Okay, now students ask a lot of questions like what percentage of the new immigrants fell within that category? I don't have a specific percentage number, but I would say it's probably a bit more than most people would think. Okay, so anyway, not something you have to memorize as far as stats, but guys, to a lot of these people, this might very well be what they would associate with their American dream, right? That idea of, okay, we're coming to the United States. There's a really cool series in the modern day. If you've ever seen it, it's called Undercover Boss. Anyway, there's a lot of episodes, but one of my favorite ones is they did an episode. If you've not seen it, it used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it still is, but anyway, and this person that they kind of emphasized was an employee at 7-Eleven. Okay. And so if you've not seen the show, like they have the undercover boss, right, as the name suggested, and he basically, or she or whoever it is, dresses up so they can't be detected. And this boss basically has this night shift with this gentleman by the name of Igor. And he finds out that Igor is from Kazakhstan, okay, which is a Central Asian republic, right? So it used to be a part of the former Soviet Union. And this guy came over. I don't think he specifically said, but I'm going to say probably in the 80s, maybe late 80s, early 90s, something like that. And he tells a story. He's like, I came here with $50 in my pocket, no English skills, and basically, eventually, he had kids. I don't know if he married an American woman or brought a spouse with him over. He didn't go into detail. But guys, the point is that he goes into all this detail about, the American dream is what you make of it, right? And for a lot of these people, that's probably very true, right? So their goal is to probably not become, as wealthy as Andrew Carnegie, right? Or maybe it is, but they probably don't achieve that. But their goal is to, okay, we want to be middle class. We want to own maybe a piece of property one day, raise a family, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So we'll come back to that in a second, but it's something to definitely keep in mind. Okay. This is actually a pretty short lesson, but there's a lot of things to think about with our conversation. So let's go ahead and move forward. So a lot of students ask the question, okay, well, Mr. Baker, these immigrants, you're welcome to pause the slide here and then follow through, guys, if you need to. But they're like, okay, well, what ports do these immigrants enter through? And the answer is 2 major ones for the most part. One is going to be East Coast. One is going to be West Coast. The East Coast one is going to be Ellis Island. So those of you that have ever been to New York and visited the Statue of Liberty, pretty much that was considered to be the signature symbol, if you will, of finally making it across the pond. Okay. So anyway, kind of a cool thing. And then also if you were coming from like a part of Asia, right, somewhere like Japan or China or somewhere like that, then you would be entering through Angel Island, which is basically San Francisco. Okay. Now keep in mind there are some other ports, but for the most part, those are the 2 that generally get the most attention. Okay. So I want you guys, as best you can, to try to put yourself in the position of somebody like Igor, right? Who I'm sure flew over, didn't actually take a ship or whatever. Okay. And you don't have much, culture as far as your language skills and things. Okay. And you basically arrive in the United States, go through, all the red tape or whatever. And now it's like, okay, I'm here. How do I approach basically being involved in American society? Okay. And for a lot of these people, guys, you got to remember a good number of them did bring families with them. Okay. And so for a lot of these people, they're like, okay, well, they experience culture shock. Okay. And the story I like to tell is that if you've ever been somewhere else where the culture is vastly different in some ways, it doesn't have to be dramatic, but it could be, something that's different. It could be, okay, I don't understand the language these people are speaking, or maybe, the way that their sense of time is different than what you're used to, right? There's all these different things, right? How they worship as far as religion, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And so culture shock is going to make some people feel uncomfortable, right? Because it's, as saying goes from Wizard of Oz, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? So, you got to figure out a way to be able to operate within a place, a country, an environment, society, if you will, that you're not as familiar with. Okay. And so these immigrants experience culture shock, right? Which is kind of the way it sounds. Okay. What do we do now? Okay. And for a lot of them, they're going to actually choose to establish their own ethnic neighborhoods. Okay. Another word that you come across every once in a while is ethnic enclave, ENCLAVE, but essentially it's the same thing. Okay. So if you've ever heard of like the Chinatowns, Little Italys, Little Havanas, right? There's different ones for different ethnic groups and things, guys. Then obviously you're very familiar with the idea of ethnic neighborhoods. Okay. Now, we're going to come back to this in a second, guys, but think about what are going to be the things that are complications if people choose to be more separate, because these ethnic neighborhoods are more separate, right? So they're not going to be, moving into, the mainstream place where, they're going to be as Americanized at this point in time. Now, this does create a series of issues for them in the next generation. We'll come back to in a second. Okay. But I remember I grew up in a small town, so to my knowledge, we really did not have ethnic neighborhoods. But I remember the first time my wife and I met. Her family is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I went up there to visit her family. And her mom and dad were like, "Hey, do you want to see where my mother-in-law grew up?" And I was like, "Sure." So we go down and we start kind of driving down the streets, and it's still kind of a cool traditional area because you have like these homes with mailboxes, and then the mailboxes still have people's names. And guys, literally, I mean, when you went from like 2 or 3 blocks to another block, you would go from like Polish town to Jewish town. I didn't see any Chinatown there, but it may be there, but not the area we went into. And so, guys, you still see in the modern day, some semblance in some areas of those ethnic neighborhoods. Okay. Anyway, so keep that in mind. Now, nativism and prejudice is going to kind of resurface in some ways. Now, a lot of you guys might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, I remember in the 1840s when we talked about the immigration of people like the Irish and the Germans, that there was a rise of nativism in the 1840s. Okay. So you're going to see, guys, over time, it's like any continuity and change historically, it kind of goes on a roller coaster ride. All right. I don't know if I would say it completely goes away in the 1850s and 60s, but, we're dealing with sectional tensions. We're dealing with, issues related to the Civil War. So therefore, maybe it doesn't get as much attention, but it resurfaces because in the 1870s, especially, you're seeing this huge influx of course, immigrants from different parts of the world. And a lot of Americans for different reasons. Some of them are going to respond because, if you were an immigrant group that's religion or maybe your culture focused on maybe drinking wine or something, you're going to see this on the next slide. You see the resurgence, excuse me, guys, of the idea of temperance, right? Having a negative effect on our society as far as like, drinking with the jobs and things. So people want that to be subsided. And so there's a little bit of attention brought to that. Okay. What is nativism? There's different ways to really look at it. But the basic nuts and bolts of nativism is that you're wanting really the government of the United States to really emphasize, Native American the culture of what you would associate with American born culture. Okay. Now that's a very loaded point because what in the world is American culture? All right. Is it learning English? Is it liking baseball as a primary sport? Right. Is it, let's say, celebrating certain holidays that you associate with maybe a certain religion or something? Okay. That's very difficult. Right. And so you're going to notice, guys, a lot of things, policies, et cetera, in this time period, policies meaning government laws and things that actually are reflecting that to an extent. All right, we'll look at that more in our next session when we study the Gilded Age politics. Okay, and the question is, what happens when you have, let's say, guys, children, right? Whether they're born here, whether they're brought here, let's say they're young, what's the most common way that those children are going to start to interact in traditional American society? It's going to be through the school. Okay. And so if you take a look here, guys, you'll notice that there's really there's more than this, but we're going to keep it kind of simple. Two major theories about how these families, these immigrants, are going to acclimate to American society. One is going to be what we call the melting pot. The other one is going to be what we call either cultural pluralism or tossed salad. Okay. Tossed salad is probably a little bit easier to remember, but the more defined term is important as well. So have you ever heard of a melting pot? Okay. So if you have, right, a lot of you guys, if you've heard of the restaurant, that's not the same thing, right? But the melting pot idea is that you're taking a lot of cultures, they're blending together, and, in the case, guys, of especially Americanization, a lot of these immigrants are blending into American society. Okay. So they're learning English, right? They're learning maybe certain customs that they associate with American customs. Okay. Now I want you to think, how do you all think that that's going to potentially affect, okay, the relationship between, let's say, first generation Americans, all right, let's say the Americans that are born here and the parents that came over. I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. The first generation that have came over and the ones that actually are growing up in the United States from a young age until they're older. Well, guys, you pretty much just said it. It's going to create some friction, right? Because, some kids are going to want to, become more acclimated. There's an interesting video out there, guys, that tells the story that one Jewish family came over to the United States, and they had, of course, the candles for like certain celebrations, and the child immediately started blowing out the candles. Okay. Would not answer to her Jewish name, would only answer to a name that was more Americanized. Now, that's an interesting story in itself because, guys, what a lot of teachers would do, okay, is that they would actually give these children revised, or shall we say more anglicized names. Okay, so I can't fathom that, right? I joke with my students, if they get on my bad side, I start taking letters off their last names. So for me, it would be Uston Acker or Uston Aker or whatever. All right, that's of course in all fun. But guys, we're literally talking about the teachers giving them a different name. All right, and in many cases, these children, being probably reasonably young, elementary school, middle school, etc., okay, are actually going to adopt these names, right? Now, some of them were simply taking a couple letters off, right? When I say simply, I don't mean that in disrespect, but, it's not too dramatic, you could say. But there's a funny story in that same video I referenced where I think it was Giuseppe Vignate, the teacher actually changed his name, get this, to Mike Jones. That's dramatically different than I think it was the Italian, obviously. And to the teacher, it's like, okay, well, Mike Jones is easier to pronounce, right? But it is affecting the cultural identity. Okay, so when somebody is really wanting to stick to their roots, they're not basically becoming any Americanized, societies. In other words, they're keeping to their own ethnic neighborhoods. That's going to be the tossed salad. Okay, so you still have an American society, but these groups are individually separated. Okay, which brings us to an interesting question that we won't spend a lot of time on, but it's something to ponder, and that is, what expectations should there be, perhaps, for any degree of Americanization, right? Those of you that have heard of Theodore Roosevelt, if you're in class, we'll look at this quote a little bit later, but if you're watching this video that is not here, he makes a really interesting statement. It's actually I think it was a 1912 speech, if I'm not mistaken, about what he thinks it means to be Americanized. Okay. And, he's pretty blunt about it, right? And I don't know if what he's saying is really 100%, okay, if you don't check off this list of things like language, etc., then you know what, you're not truly Americanized. But he does have a very strong opinion about, in his view, the responsibility of some immigrants to at least Americanize to an extent. Okay. So anyway, something to definitely keep in the back of our minds. So melting pot, you're blending into American society, you're learning the culture more, you're interacting with it more. Toss salad or cultural pluralism, you're more separate. Okay, so I want you, last but not least, guys, this slide will take about 5 to 10 minutes. So you're welcome to pause it again if you need to. But guys, I want you to think about how do all those urban issues that we just talked about have potential to create a whole other set of things that need to be changed, because we haven't talked extensively about reform, as far as really focusing on the name reform or the word reform, since all those reforms that we looked at prior to the Civil War, right? So women's rights, abolition, education, prisons, etc. Okay, Second Great Awakening, the list goes on and on. Okay, but guys, what we notice is that in this time period, reform becomes a large piece of the puzzle. And a lot of this is because of the effects of industrialization, which also, of course, have an effect on urbanization, right? People want to work in the factories more. Ergo, they move to the cities. Cause and effect, all right? In this case, the effects are, okay, how do we try to remedy some of these problems like urban poverty, right? Trying to help, immigrants acclimate to society, some of the other issues, okay? So first of all, guys, remember what we said before? Reformers are usually people or organizations. They usually have goals, right? And they usually also have outcomes. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, you're like, okay, well, Mr. Baker, government doesn't seem to be really involved in reform in this time period. And the answer is that's a pretty good observation that you made. And that's going to be an issue that progressives try to actually, and you could say they were successful in a lot of ways, and in some ways not as much, but that's a story for later. All right. But guys, progressives are going to agree with that. They're going to say, whoa, okay, government needs to be more involved to remedy the problems of society that perhaps ordinary, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, guys, but ordinary citizens are not able to do. Maybe they don't have the financial resources to do it, etc. And government feels like the public good is something that they need to be more involved in. Okay, why do I bring this up? A couple of key names and a couple of big organizations. Now, one of my favorite urban reformers, and she's a progressive as well, so there is a connection, guys, with those time periods, as you probably have caught on to, is going to be Jane Addams. Okay, and so that's her picture, guys. So Jane Addams, as you can see, pretty young in that picture. I'll show you a quote on this here in a second. All right, but Jane Addams, guys, is really going to be like, okay, there's several problems. Urban poverty exists. And the connection to that also is that we have overcrowding. We have, this large pool of immigrants that are entering America. They don't really have maybe some of the skills with English, etc. Okay. So guys, one of the biggest things that Miss Addams did, and by the way, her last name is 2 D's, not one. Okay. So it is spelled differently than John Adams and Abigail. All right. Just want to point that out to y'all. Okay. But she establishes the concept of a settlement house. Okay. So if you're kind of wondering what in the world is a settlement house, the Whole House in Chicago is a good example. Okay, so this picture, guys, that I have my cursor on is exactly what we're talking about. So this Whole House, it's big. I've not been there before. I do believe there it can be toured, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a really neat place, I've heard. Okay, and so what this Whole House is meant to do is it's meant to house people, give them temporary housing. To my knowledge, guys, these houses were not meant to be your lifelong residence. Okay, so she wants to equip people with the skills and the tools, if you will. Okay, to actually be able to, if you're an immigrant, you need to learn the language, you need to get an established job. If you're homeless, same basic thing. Okay, and the end result, guys, is the ultimate goal on the part of her approach to reform is the idea of being able to eventually be self-reliant. Okay. So these are meant to be community centers. If you're teenagers, right, and families, right, you go there, you get help. Okay. Social services, the idea of social work, as you can see here. Okay. Which is a very important profession, guys. If you've not heard of it, a lot of people that work in social work, they work with, this is not the only thing, but just an example, they work with people that are involved with like social services with adoption and foster care and all these different programs to support the public and people that obviously have some needs. Okay, so guys, I'm a real big fan of hers if you couldn't catch that. I mean, her work is absolutely essential. Okay. Social gospel movement. There's definitely a connection to religion with that movement as well as Adams. Okay. So apply biblical principles to those that to help those in society. All right. I need to point this out. This is not the same thing as the gospel of wealth. Okay. Because the gospel of wealth was really more geared toward if you're a millionaire or somebody with a ton of money, then you have a responsibility to be philanthropic. Okay. This group of people, guys, for the most part, is really going to have to work. Not to say that the big titans of industry weren't working to gain their wealth, but these people really have to put a lot of resources together to actually be able to get these resources to help other people out. Okay. So charity and justice, right? The idea of fairness to others. Okay. Temperance. Guys, what do we already know about temperance? Yeah, a movement, in this case, guys, to stop activities that are harmful to society. We associate that in this context with the idea of alcohol use being stopped. Okay. And the goal was eventually prohibition. Okay. There is an amendment that is eventually added to our Constitution. Now, it's not going to be the most effective amendment in the world, but it is going to be a result of urban reform that eventually comes later with progressives. Okay. Purity in general, basically, hey, you don't drink. Why? Because you want to protect your family from not having money, right? Because you need money, right? Okay. So it makes a lot of sense, right? If people were going out and they were using alcohol irresponsibly, their family suffers, then you know what? That needs to be stopped according to this way of thinking. Okay. Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU for short, that's an organization. It's like it sounds. Okay. So their goal is going to eventually be to have a society of no alcohol use. So they're going to really bring a lot of attention, to some of the immigrant groups that are coming in. Why? Because it's like, well, your religion promotes drinking, right? Perhaps. Okay. And last but not least, this is one of my favorite things about urban reform. And I don't know if any of you guys know much about this, but it's very, very cool. So the community park system. Now, I know all of you, if you're like me, when I was younger, I used to love to go to the park. Okay. Come to find out later on, my mom sent me to the park most of the time so that I would run myself ragged, get tired, and take a nap so she could have some peace. Okay. So eventually, you know, that might be a little bit of truth to why parks were created in the longer term. But guys, the big principle here is that they're going to be created because, guys, think about it like this: when you're building cities, or at least, kind of furthering them, nature is compromised, right? So you don't have as many trees, you don't have as many, bushes and things like that. In other words, these people, guys, are thinking, man, you walk out and all you see is buildings and skyscrapers and steel stuff and all that, right? A lot of people saw that as kind of drab, right? And so an architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, there's a lot of parks named after this guy, okay? He's an architect, like I just said, and he's going to be like, yep, we need to do something to make cities more visually appealing. All right. Think about, guys, when you have parks, what are people more likely to do? Like if you've ever been to Central Park in New York, or some of the other, even smaller scale parks that are obviously, maybe neighborhood parks or whatever. Okay. What do we see people doing there? We see them playing baseball. We see them having concerts. We see them obviously having, maybe tracks that people can run around, right, to be exercising. We see dog parks. Okay. So, guys, in other words, it makes people get out, enjoy nature, enjoy exercise. The list goes on and on. Okay. And that essentially is what Olmsted is going to advocate for. Okay. And this movement catches on. Okay. And those of you that have ever heard of, like, the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina and Asheville, or maybe certain college campuses. Okay. A lot of college campuses, guys, believe it or not all of them, but some of them, right, are actually going to center their campus layouts and things like that around the idea of these parks, right? So if you've ever heard somebody say, man, I went to this campus, it was beautiful. They had, animals and, maybe not like petting zoo animals, but obviously like little areas that you could go to, like walk around places and stuff. Okay. Then there's a possibility that that might be an Olmsted influence. All right. Last but not least, I told y'all we were going to come back to Jane Addams. Okay. And this is my last point. But guys, we're going to do our next lesson on Gilded Age politics. And then the lessons after that, the next 2 or 3, are going to be centered around a big concept of progressivism. You'll notice she makes this statement in 1910, which is actually shortly into, the 20th century. Okay. And she's talking about settlement houses, social justice, right? The idea of helping people that are in need. And guys, the question here is, what does this quote indicate about Adams's philosophy on urban reform? And look at what she says. The opening of the whole house combined the 3 trends. First, the desire to interpret democracy in social terms. And thirdly, the Christian movement toward humanitarianism. The settlement then, and she capitalizes that for a reason, is an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the social and industrial problems which are engendered by the modern conditions of life in a great city. Okay. So what could we say about her approach to urban reform? First of all, being able to be active is democratic, with trying to extend things like equality, perhaps rights, protections for people that are disadvantaged. Okay. There's a Christian responsibility, according to her thinking, to think like a humanitarian, because it's a big overarching word. Okay. In other words, social gospel. And guys, look at the last thing. A lot of these conditions are products of urbanization, are products of industrialization. In other words, they're modern issues that require people to be more active with trying to actually remedy them. Okay? Hope you had a good class. I know I did. Stay safe. And as always, guys, feel free to email me at bakerd@franklinacademy.org. And I will look forward to seeing you next time when we start to explore the important aspect of this, which is the Gilded Age politics. And I hope you're doing well. Have a good one. Thank you.